In 1945, as Berlin burned, Soviet loudspeakers echoed across the ruins with a message chillingly familiar to those who had once heard Goebbels. "The enemy is at your door. Fight for the motherland." Few realized that the slogans, the imagery, even the tone, had all been borrowed from the very regime the Soviets had just destroyed. Stalin didn't just defeat Nazi Germany. He studied it, dissected it, and rebuilt its propaganda machine under a red flag. Fact 1. The Mirror of Fear. How Stalin repurposed Hitler's language. When the Nazi regime collapsed, so did its propaganda empire, an immense apparatus built on the worship of the state and the dehumanization of its enemies. Joseph Goebbels had perfected the art of controlling emotion through fear. Fear of chaos, of traitors, of the enemy within. Stalin saw that it worked. And within months of victory, the same psychological formula reappeared in Soviet media, this time directed at Western imperialists. In early 1946, Pravda headlines began to mirror Goebbels' own wartime bulletins, where Goebbels had written of defending civilization from Bolshevik barbarism. Stalin's press now warned of protecting socialism from fascist contagion. Both relied on identical language: purification, vigilance, loyalty. Soviet citizens were told that spies and saboteurs hid among them, that doubt itself was treason. In the Red Army's official publications, the enemy was no longer Hitler, but the idea of the West, described in terms almost interchangeable with Nazi portrayals of the Jews: decadent, parasitic, corrosive. Even the structure of mass rallies and parades reflected a direct borrowing. Goebbels had filled stadiums with orchestrated unity, faces lifted toward the Führer's image. By 1949, Stalin's May Day celebrations followed the same choreography. Synchronized banners, chants of devotion, the leader's portrait towering above. The emotional architecture was the same. The only difference was the symbols. Propaganda films of the late 1940s, such as The Fall of Berlin, transformed Stalin into a semi-divine figure, descending among his people, much as Hitler had been shown in Triumph of the Will. Both used identical cinematic grammar: low camera angles, choreographed lighting, masses moving as one. The message was not political, it was spiritual obedience. What Stalin understood, and perhaps what terrified him most, was that propaganda was not about persuasion, it was about substitution. Replace the swastika with the hammer and sickle, the word Aryan with proletarian, and the machinery of emotional control remained intact. The Soviet citizen, like the German before him, was not taught to think but to feel, to fear, and to worship. By the time the Iron Curtain descended, the echo was complete. Stalin had conquered Nazi Germany's land, but he had quietly inherited its language of total control. Fact 2. The Cult of the Leader. From the Führer to the Vожdь. When Berlin fell, Stalin understood something crucial about power. Fear alone could not sustain devotion. Hitler's greatest achievement, he realized, was not military, it was psychological. The Nazis had replaced faith with a man. The Führer had become Germany's religion. Stalin took that revelation and rebuilt it brick by brick in Moscow. In the years after the war, Soviet propaganda transformed Stalin from a political figure into a living myth. The similarities to Nazi Germany's cult of Hitler were uncanny. The same visual vocabulary appeared everywhere: monumental portraits, children reciting prayers of loyalty, public rituals staged to resemble religious processions. Newspapers no longer spoke of decisions of the party, but of the wisdom of Comrade Stalin. He was described not as a politician, but as the son of nations. Just as Goebbels had flooded Germany with images of the Führer surrounded by adoring crowds, Soviet filmmakers produced scenes of workers crying with gratitude in Stalin's presence. The emotional choreography was identical. The trembling hands, the controlled tears, the collective gasp as the leader appeared. Soviet cinematography borrowed the Nazi grammar of worship, the upward camera angles, the radiating light, the sense that history itself emanated from one man's shadow. In 1949, when Stalin turned 70, Moscow held a celebration that might have come straight from Nuremberg. Massive parades, synchronized youth formations, choirs singing, "Thank you, Comrade Stalin." The leader stood above, silent, expressionless, an image lifted straight from the aesthetic of the Führer balcony moments. The propaganda purpose was the same, to turn the individual into the embodiment of destiny. Even the language of loyalty crossed ideological lines. Nazi Germany had demanded Heil Hitler, hail the leader. Stalin's Soviet Union echoed with Slava Stalinu, glory to Stalin. Both phrases carried the same emotional rhythm, short, chantable, ritualistic. In both societies, to remain silent when others praised the leader was to risk being accused of disloyalty. Underneath, however, lay a grim irony. Stalin despised Hitler personally, yet he learned from him professionally. The very methods once used to enslave Germany became blueprints for Stalin's control over the USSR. By the early 1950s, Soviet citizens lived inside a mirror image of the world they had just destroyed. Only the banners had changed color. The man who claimed to have defeated fascism had, in the process, absorbed its soul. Fact 3. The enemy within. How Stalin revived Goebbels' invisible foe. Every totalitarian regime needs an enemy, not abroad, but inside. Joseph Goebbels had built the Nazi system on that psychological pillar. He convinced Germans that treason lived next door, that spies, Jews, and parasites hid behind every curtain. When the Red Army stormed Berlin, that idea should have died in the rubble. Instead, Stalin resurrected it, dressed in new colors, speaking a new language, but carrying the same poison. Between 1946 and 1953, Soviet propaganda began to mirror Goebbels' fear campaigns almost word for word. The Jewish conspirator became the Western agent. The traitor to the Aryan race turned into the enemy of the people. Newspapers screamed of sabotage in factories, doctors poisoning patients, professors spreading foreign lies. The state didn't need proof, it needed hysteria. Fear had to flow downward endlessly until it touched every home. In Nazi Germany, people whispered about Gestapo lists. In Stalin's USSR, they feared the NKVD knock at night. Both organizations operated under the same psychological mechanism, the belief that guilt was contagious. Propaganda films, posters, and radio shows reminded citizens daily that the enemy hides among us. In classrooms, children were taught to report unpatriotic talk. Housewives denounced neighbors for suspicious behavior. Fear became a civic duty. The Doctor's Plot of 1952, one of the final purges of Stalin's rule, could have been lifted from a Nazi pamphlet. Jewish doctors were accused of conspiring with Western intelligence to kill Soviet leaders. Evidence was fabricated, confessions tortured, and headlines screamed of filthy conspirators undermining the state. The rhetoric was pure Goebbels, racialized, moralistic, and absolute. The same paranoid energy that had justified Nazi exterminations now fueled Soviet purges. What Stalin mastered was the emotional rhythm of suspicion. He understood that propaganda's greatest power was not persuasion, it was exhaustion. When people live long enough in fear of invisible enemies, they stop asking whether the threat is real. They simply obey. By the time Stalin died, millions of Soviet citizens had internalized the same logic the Nazis once used, that purity of the nation required vigilance, that one's safety depended on denunciation, and that silence could be fatal. Thus, the enemy within, Goebbels' most toxic invention, survived Hitler's fall. Under Stalin, it gained a new uniform, a new anthem, and an even longer shadow. Fact 4. The machinery of myth. Stalin's borrowed spectacle of power. If there was one thing the Nazis understood better than anyone, it was performance. The swastika was never just a flag. It was theater, psychology, hypnosis. Joseph Goebbels turned every rally, every march, every torchlight parade into a ritual of awe, where individuals dissolved into one body, one will, one faith. When the war ended, Stalin saw that this wasn't just propaganda. It was technology, a machine that could shape human emotion on command. By 1947, Moscow's Red Square had become the Soviet Nuremberg. Banners, columns, music, synchronized chants, everything designed to erase individuality and replace it with belonging. The rhythm was unmistakably familiar. Soviet engineers studied Nazi rally films, not to mock them, but to master them. The formation of youth brigades, the floodlights against the night sky, the mass choreography, all mirrored the Nazi playbook, only painted in red instead of black. In both systems, architecture became propaganda. Hitler had built colossal monuments to his ideology. Stalin followed suit. The Moscow metro, with its marble pillars and golden mosaics, was conceived as the palace of the people, a secular cathedral, much like Albert Speer's grandiose vision of Germania. Both sought to translate ideology into stone, to make belief a physical experience. Walking through those spaces, a citizen was meant to feel small before the immensity of the state. Film and radio played their parts, too. Goebbels' triumph of the will had taught the world how to glorify power with light, movement, and music. Soviet director Mikhail Chiaureli's The Fall of Berlin in 1950 copied the formula exactly. In it, Stalin appears as a divine savior descending from the clouds to bless the liberated city, a scene uncannily close to the messianic framing of Hitler's appearances. The camera angles, the crowd's tears, the orchestral swell, the language of fascism rewritten in Cyrillic. Even the slogans marched in parallel. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one people, one nation, one leader, became one people, one party, one Stalin. The structure was identical, the promise the same: unity through obedience. The individual did not matter, the collective did. By mastering the aesthetics of the enemy, Stalin built something even more enduring, a propaganda system so powerful it survived him. His May Day parades, his cult of imagery, his carefully staged moments of spontaneous joy became templates for all who came after. What began as imitation became inheritance. The machinery of myth that once served fascism now powered communism, and millions staring up at the same carefully lit sky never noticed the switch. Fact 5. The Holy War, Stalin's copy of Hitler's sacred language. In 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Nazi radio called it Der Heilige Krieg, the Holy War. The term was meant to sanctify slaughter, to give mass violence a moral halo. 4 years later, when Soviet troops marched into Berlin, Stalin's propagandists used that same phrase, Sviashchanaya Voina. The words had changed tongues, but not meaning. The war was no longer political. It was sacred. Goebbels had always known that propaganda worked best when it mimicked religion. He built an entire pseudo-church around the Reich, the Führer as Messiah, the party as faith, the rallies as liturgy. Stalin's genius, or his cynicism, was in realizing that the USSR needed the same emotional structure, only under atheism's disguise. In the late 1940s, Soviet propaganda stopped describing the war as a victory of systems and began to call it a victory of good over evil. The Great Patriotic War became the foundation of a new civic religion. Its saints were fallen soldiers, its temples were monuments, its Bible was the film reel. Soviet newsreels used orchestral hymns eerily close to Nazi anthems, the same deep baritone choirs, the same celestial imagery of light breaking through smoke. Even the vocabulary of purity and sacrifice crossed the ideological border intact. In Nazi Germany, citizens were told they must remain pure for the Reich. In Stalin's USSR, they were told to remain ideologically pure for socialism. In both cases, propaganda blurred moral lines until obedience became holiness. To dissent was to sin. To believe was to be saved. The Soviet press soon baptized Stalin himself in that same holy narrative. He was the father of nations, the protector of peace, the guardian of civilization. His portraits were placed above classrooms and factories, replacing crucifixes in a land that claimed to have banished God. The rituals of worship, parades, songs, tears, were identical to those once offered to Hitler. The hymn Sviashchenaya Vojna, the Sacred War, first written during the German invasion, was reintroduced after 1945 as a permanent part of Soviet life. It opened radio broadcasts, school assemblies, and state ceremonies for decades. Its lyrics could have fit on either side of the front. Rise up, vast country, rise to the fight of life and death. Through that single word, sacred, Stalin preserved Hitler's most effective tool, moral inversion. Both dictators understood that if you make war sound holy, people will die willingly. By the time Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet Union had inherited more than Nazi territory. It had inherited its theology: faith without God, devotion without mercy, and war without end. Fact 6. The theater of lies. Stalin's borrowed blueprint for total illusion. Goebbels had once said that propaganda must not just persuade, it must create reality. Under Hitler, truth was no longer something to be found, it was something to be manufactured. Stalin listened, learned, and perfected the craft. Where the Nazis turned lies into spectacle, Stalin turned spectacle into history. By the late 1940s, the Soviet Union was living inside its own theater, a mirror built from the enemy's ruins. After the war, Soviet newspapers looked eerily like their German predecessors. Front pages no longer reported events. They narrated destiny. Every achievement, from a new steel mill to a school opening, was staged as proof of the leader's genius. Every failure was hidden beneath invented triumphs. Goebbels had called this the aesthetic of control, the belief that beauty and order could hide rot. Stalin embraced it fully. The film industry became the front line of this illusion. Where Goebbels had commissioned Triumph of the Will, Stalin ordered The Fall of Berlin. Both were epic propaganda dramas presenting war not as tragedy, but as revelation. Both used identical visual codes: spotless uniforms, slow-motion marches, sunlight cutting through clouds, and a godlike leader descending to bless the faithful. Only the colors had changed, the brown banners replaced with red. In Nazi Germany, propaganda exalted the new man, strong, disciplined, born of struggle. Stalin's Soviet Union answered with the new Soviet man, tireless, loyal, incapable of doubt. Each was a sculpted illusion meant to erase individuality. Artists, writers, and filmmakers were ordered to depict perfection, not truth. And just like the Reich's Ministry of Propaganda and Enlightenment, the Soviet Agitprop department censored reality itself. The similarities ran deeper than style. Goebbels' office had perfected staged newsreels, battles filmed days after they occurred, with soldiers reenacting attacks for the camera. In the 1940s, Soviet directors used the same method. Footage of heroic liberations was shot after the fact, often in reconstructed ruins. What the world saw was not war, it was theater, curated frame by frame. By 1950, Stalin's propaganda had achieved what Goebbels only dreamed of: a world where fiction became permanent. History was rewritten yearly, heroes vanished from photographs, victories were exaggerated until they replaced fact. People no longer knew what was real. And that was the point. The Nazi Ministry of Lies died in 1945, but its ghost found a new stage in Moscow. Under Stalin, truth itself became an actor, disciplined, obedient, and expendable. Fact 7. The architecture of fear, from the Gestapo office to the Lubyanka cell. When the Red Army captured Berlin in 1945, Soviet officers entered the ruined headquarters of the Gestapo. Files, maps, photographs, a complete anatomy of terror lay before them. Stalin didn't order it burned. He ordered it studied. What the Nazis had built, a state that ruled not by belief, but by fear, fascinated him. Within a few years, its blueprints were reassembled, almost perfectly, inside the Soviet Union. In Nazi Germany, the Gestapo had been invisible, yet omnipresent. Its genius was psychological. Citizens didn't need to see it to obey it. Rumor and paranoia did the work. Stalin's NKVD, later renamed the MGB, adopted the same principle. Like the Gestapo, it was small compared to the population, but magnified by myth. Neighbors whispered that agents could hear through walls. Workers avoided eye contact on trains. The silence itself became an instrument of control. The mechanics were identical. The Gestapo relied on civilian informants, teachers, clerks, janitors, all writing quiet denunciations. Stalin's system improved it, turning informant culture into a patriotic duty. Schoolchildren were taught to protect the motherland from enemies of socialism by reporting suspicious talk. Posters declared, "If you see something, say something." The phrase, decades later, would echo again in other societies, stripped of its origins. Even the space of fear was copied. The Gestapo's Prince Albrecht Strasse in Berlin became infamous for its interrogation chambers, concrete, windowless, humming with electricity. In Moscow, the Lubyanka served the same symbolic purpose. Both buildings stood at the heart of the capital, as physical reminders that power listened. Both operated on ritual precision. The same late-night arrests, the same forced confessions, the same bureaucratic paperwork transforming terror into routine. The visual language of these institutions also mirrored each other. The Gestapo used sharp lines, black leather, and geometric order, a theater of dominance. The NKVD offices adopted similar aesthetics: dark corridors, polished floors, silence broken only by the echo of boots. The goal wasn't secrecy, but awe. To enter was to feel small before a machine larger than the self. Goebbels once described fear as the most efficient form of obedience. Stalin proved him right. Under his rule, the machinery of terror became industrialized. Quotas replaced trials. Confessions replaced evidence. In both regimes, propaganda praised vigilance, a word that justified everything from surveillance to execution. By 1953, the NKVD's power reached beyond the grave. Even after Stalin's death, citizens still lowered their voices at night. They still avoided the word Lubyanka. The architecture of fear had become cultural, inherited, instinctive, self-perpetuating. In the end, the Gestapo's buildings crumbled, but their design, invisible fear, visible power, survived. Under a different flag, in a different city, the walls were built again, and once more, people learned to sleep lightly because someone might be listening. Fact 8. The Enemy's Mirror: How Stalin Turned Nazi Censorship into a Science. The Nazi regime had called it Gleichschaltung, coordination. It was the process of aligning every thought, every publication, every voice with the state's will. Goebbels turned it into an art form. No newspaper printed a single word that hadn't been approved by his ministry. Stalin watched closely. When the Reich fell, he didn't dismantle that model. He perfected it. The Soviet Union became the most tightly controlled information system the world had ever seen, built on the bones of Nazi censorship. By 1946, Stalin's censors, the Glavlit, had already studied German methods of press control captured in Berlin. They admired the efficiency, the hierarchy, the meticulous way Goebbels cataloged forbidden phrases. In Moscow, those same methods were expanded to an entire civilization. Books were rewritten, names erased, photographs retouched. But where the Nazi system silenced dissent through ideology, Stalin's machine silenced it through time by rewriting the past until no alternative version could exist. In Nazi Germany, journalists received daily guidelines dictating what could be printed. In Stalin's USSR, editors received hourly phone calls. A single misused adjective could cost a man his life. The Pravda newspaper became the Soviet equivalent of Goebbels's Völkischer Beobachter, an official gospel rather than a source of news. Readers learned to read it like scripture, deciphering what was not said more carefully than what was. Even literature became a battlefield. Hitler had burned books. Stalin burned authors. Writers like Bulgakov, Platonov, and Mandelstam were erased from libraries, their names unspoken, their works destroyed or rewritten to glorify the party. The Nazi Book of the Reich, which listed forbidden works, found its echo in Soviet indexes of politically harmful literature. Both regimes feared imagination more than opposition. Cinema, too, followed the same commandments. Goebbels had understood the hypnotic power of film, how music and motion could replace logic. Stalin institutionalized it. Every movie became a state project, reviewed by party officials before release. Films that failed to show the correct emotional tone were shelved forever. The censors even controlled color, forbidding excessive brightness in war films to maintain serious patriotic mood. It was aesthetic obedience, the same control through atmosphere that the Nazis had mastered. Perhaps the most chilling inheritance was the illusion of participation. Both regimes claimed the people themselves demanded censorship. Nazi editors spoke of protecting the German soul. Soviet officials spoke of guarding the purity of socialist thought. In both languages, tyranny disguised itself as care. By 1950, the Soviet Union had built what Goebbels could only dream of, a society where people censored themselves. No bonfires, no spectacle, just quiet, instinctive silence. Every mind became its own censor's desk. The Gestapo had once monitored what Germans read. Stalin's censors no longer needed to. The echo of Goebbels' ministry had evolved into something even more efficient. An empire of silence, where truth didn't need to be forbidden. It simply ceased to exist. Fact 9. The useful monster. How Stalin inherited Hitler's scapegoat strategy. When the Third Reich began to crumble, Joseph Goebbels left behind more than ruins. He left a manual on survival through hatred. In his last speeches, he urged Germans to stay united against the eternal enemy, even as their cities burned. The idea was simple. When power fails, blame an outsider. Stalin understood that formula perfectly. He didn't destroy it. He rewrote it in Russian. In the Soviet Union, the Jew, the dissident, the enemy of socialism became the new Jew, Bolshevik, and parasite of Nazi mythology. The words changed, the faces changed, but the purpose was identical: to give the people someone to hate instead of something to question. The genius of totalitarianism was not control of truth. It was the ability to control anger. After 1945, Stalin's propaganda turned the West into the new eternal enemy. Newspapers described America and Britain with the same fevered imagery Goebbels had once used for the Jews: corrupt, decadent, diseased. Posters showed capitalist hands dripping with blood, grasping for Soviet land. In the Nazi era, propaganda had portrayed the Jew as both weak and dangerously powerful. Stalin's artists did the same with the imperialist, foolish yet all-controlling, greedy yet terrified. The contradiction didn't matter, the emotion did. When the Soviet famine of 1946 hit, killing millions, the state didn't admit failure. It blamed foreign saboteurs. When railways broke down, it wasn't mismanagement, it was enemy infiltration. This language had a long ancestry. Hitler had blamed Jewish bankers for Germany's inflation. Stalin blamed foreign agents for Soviet shortages. Both regimes discovered that if you teach people to see ghosts, they'll never notice the fire in their own house. The most cynical continuation of this strategy came during Stalin's final years, the so-called doctor's plot. In 1952, Jewish doctors in Moscow were accused of conspiring to poison Soviet leaders. The evidence was fabricated, the trials staged, the fear real. Crowds demanded punishment. State newspapers called it a battle against Zionist fascism. It was Goebbels' anti-Semitic theater, revived word for word, only now in a socialist key. Stalin's propaganda ministry even reused Nazi imagery: caricatures of hook-nosed doctors, headlines about foreign poison, and speeches warning of a global cabal. The same myth that had justified Hitler's genocide now fueled Stalin's paranoia. What had been fascist racism became socialist vigilance. The result was the same: humiliation, imprisonment, disappearance. By the time Stalin died in 1953, hatred had become the state's most renewable resource. The Nazis had weaponized it and lost a war. Stalin institutionalized it and built an empire. The myth of the useful enemy. invisible, conspiratorial, eternal, survived both men. It was the perfect tool because it never required proof, only fear. And in that mirror of hatred, the red and black banners blurred into the same color. Fact 10. The Children of the State. How Stalin rebuilt the Hitler Youth in Red. One of the Reich's most chilling inventions was the Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth, a generation molded from childhood to worship the state, obey without thought, and see war as destiny. Its uniforms, songs, and rituals were not accidental. They were a calculated investment in the future, designed to erase individuality before adulthood. When Stalin's propagandists studied the ruins of Germany, they saw not just a defeated army, but a model for control that began in the cradle. By 1946, Soviet newspapers began glorifying a new generation of young pioneers. They wore red scarves instead of brown shirts, but the mission was identical. Loyalty above all, belief without doubt, sacrifice without hesitation. The organization borrowed everything from the Hitler Youth's playbook: morning salutes, group marches, pledges to the leader, and ceremonial songs exalting the state. Even the word comrade replaced brother in the same cadence. Like Goebbels' system, the Soviet one turned education into indoctrination. Children learned to read through patriotic slogans and arithmetic through examples of war production. Textbooks described Stalin as the father of all nations, a benevolent, all-seeing figure who guided their every step. School plays reenacted moments of his heroism. And like their German counterparts, Soviet children were taught that enemies surrounded them: foreign spies, bourgeois saboteurs, traitors. Suspicion became a virtue, loyalty an instinct. The parallels reached their most disturbing depth in ritual. Nazi propaganda had required weekly faith meetings, where young Germans sang hymns to Hitler and pledged to live for Germany. In the Soviet Union, pioneer assemblies followed the same rhythm, the same mass chanting, the same emotional crescendo, only with new words: for Stalin, for the motherland, for peace. The emotional training was the same: obedience wrapped in joy. Both systems replaced family with ideology. In Hitler's Germany, children were told that the Führer was their true parent. In Stalin's Russia, the party was. Denouncing one's father for an unpatriotic comment was not betrayal. It was duty. Cases spread through the 1940s press of children reporting parents for counter-revolutionary speech. These stories were celebrated, not condemned. The message was clear: loyalty to the state outweighed love itself. Even the visual language aligned. Propaganda posters of bright-eyed boys gazing toward the horizon echoed the Nazi aesthetic of purity and destiny. The young Soviet hero Pavlik Morozov, who allegedly betrayed his own father for hiding grain, became a martyr figure, a Soviet answer to the Nazi ideal of the faithful youth. His legend was printed in every textbook, his statue raised in schools. By turning children into soldiers of ideology, Stalin guaranteed that his system would outlive him. Where the Nazis failed through collapse, the Soviets succeeded through continuity. The faces changed, the uniforms changed, but the choreography of obedience remained. In both regimes, innocence was the first casualty. The child no longer belonged to the family or to himself. He belonged to history. And history, in those hands, demanded worship. Fact 11. The perfect illusion of peace. Stalin's copy. Of Hitler's human face. After 1939, Nazi Germany learned that brutality alone could not win hearts abroad. Goebbels invented a dual propaganda strategy: terror at home, reassurance abroad. Foreign journalists saw smiling workers, modern cities, peaceful parades. The Reich hid its violence behind images of prosperity and discipline. When the Soviet Union emerged from the ashes of war, Stalin revived the same tactic. The Red Army had crushed fascism. Now Soviet propaganda would borrow its charm. Between 1946 and 1952, a strange transformation swept through Soviet media. The war's gray realism was replaced with color music, and smiles. Films like The Kuban Cossacks and The Fall of Berlin painted the USSR as a land of abundance and joy. Collective farms overflowing with food, families laughing beneath portraits of Stalin. It was the mirror image of Nazi cinema in 1938, where German peasants sang under portraits of Hitler. The message was the same. Life under the leader is happiness. Just as the Nazis used cultural diplomacy, concerts, art exhibitions, foreign tours, to disguise their totalitarianism, Stalin launched the peace offensive. Soviet ballet companies toured Europe, choirs sang songs of friendship, and diplomats handed out brochures titled "The Soviet Union, Land of Progress and Peace." Behind the curtain, gulags expanded, famine raged in Ukraine, and secret trials continued. But the world saw only dancers and smiles. Goebbels had once declared that propaganda must never look like propaganda. Stalin took that to perfection. Soviet magazines began printing photographs of blooming orchards, hydroelectric dams, and young women in aviation uniforms. The tone was almost tender, technological beauty masking human misery. Foreign visitors, carefully escorted through choreographed model towns, wrote glowing reports of Soviet prosperity, just as Western journalists had once been seduced by the Nazi model village of Theresienstadt. Even the language of peace became a weapon. Hitler had promised peace through strength. Stalin's ministers coined peace through socialism. Both phrases served the same purpose, to turn aggression into virtue. When the Soviets blockaded Berlin in 1948, state media described it as a defensive action for world peace. Every expansion of power was framed as protection, every occupation as liberation. Perhaps the most haunting similarity lay in how both regimes portrayed women. Nazi propaganda glorified the Aryan mother as the sacred bearer of the future. Stalin's press mirrored this precisely. The Soviet mother was radiant, strong, eternally grateful to the state for her child's life. Her husband might be dead or vanished into the camps, but the party had become her new family. Both visions erased real suffering under the glow of national motherhood. By 1950, the illusion had worked. Millions abroad saw the USSR as a heroic force of progress. Inside, those same citizens starved in silence. It was the final evolution of Goebbels' dream, a total lie that looked like love. The Nazis had fooled the world for 6 years. Stalin fooled it for decades. Behind both smiles stood the same truth. The greater the fear inside, the brighter the mask outside. Fact 12. The Eternal Victory, Stalin's final theft from the Reich. In May 1945, as Soviet troops raised the red banner over the Reichstag, one empire died, and another learned how not to die. Hitler's Third Reich had built its identity around victory that could never end. Even as the war collapsed, Goebbels promised final triumph. It was not just a lie, it was a survival mechanism. The myth of endless victory gave meaning to suffering. Stalin understood that perfectly. He didn't dismantle that myth. He inherited it, reshaped it, and made it the Soviet Union's new religion. In the years after the war, Soviet propaganda stopped speaking of recovery or reconstruction. It spoke only of eternal victory. Statues, parades, and films replayed 1945 again and again, not as history, but as prophecy. Every May 9th became a ritual, every veteran a saint. Stalin's victory cult was built from the same bricks as Hitler's: selective memory, sanctified sacrifice, and the belief that the nation's suffering proved its greatness. Goebbels had made the Nazi defeat of France into a national sacrament, a story retold daily through film, art, and school books. Stalin did the same with Berlin. Soviet cinema replayed the capture of the city as if it had happened yesterday. Children learned maps of the liberation routes, mothers cried at patriotic concerts, and soldiers in new uniforms paraded past the same Lenin mausoleum that had once seen coffins return from the front. The war was over, but it was never allowed to end. The purpose was psychological. Hitler's myth of victory had been designed to erase doubt, Stalin's was designed to erase despair. A starving nation could endure anything if told it had already triumphed. "We have already won," said every poster, even as ration lines stretched for miles. Goebbels had declared, "The German nation will never kneel." Stalin rewrote it as, "The Soviet people will never be defeated." The same rhythm, the same lie. Both regimes weaponized memory. The Nazis glorified the fallen of Verdun. The Soviets glorified the fallen of Stalingrad. Both built monuments not to mourning, but to obedience, places where the living were reminded of their debt. In Moscow, the eternal flame burned for those who died for Stalin, even when his name was whispered with fear. By the time Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet Union had become a country permanently at war, not with armies, but with truth. The victory that began in Berlin was repeated until it replaced the present. The flags of two dead empires, the swastika and the Red Star, had carried the same promise, that through suffering came purity, through death came glory, and through victory came silence. It was the last and most devastating theft. Stalin didn't just take Nazi propaganda, he took its heartbeat. And for decades the world would continue to march to its rhythm, believing that one tyranny had defeated another, when in truth, one had simply learned to wear the other's smile. Fact 13. The Living Ghosts. How Stalin turned Nazi memory into his shield. When the smoke of Berlin faded, the world wanted closure. The war had been won, evil defeated, justice done. But Stalin knew that peace could be dangerous. Peace invited questions, and questions threatened control. So he revived Hitler's most cynical idea, that a regime could live forever by keeping its people afraid of ghosts. Nazi ghosts. After 1945, Soviet propaganda began to speak of fascism not as something destroyed, but as something waiting, an infection that could return at any moment. The word fascist became a political weapon, an accusation that needed no proof. In Nazi Germany, Goebbels had called Jews and Bolsheviks eternal enemies. In Stalin's USSR, fascists became a shape-shifting enemy who could be anyone, a poet, a farmer, a neighbor. The term no longer described an ideology. It described whoever displeased power. Films, newspapers, and posters warned that the fascist beast is wounded, not dead. Every problem, every protest, every shortage was blamed on its invisible hand. When a worker complained about hunger, he was told that fascist saboteurs were poisoning the harvest. When a scientist questioned a state policy, he was accused of spreading Hitlerite pseudoscience. Even decades after the war, the word fascist echoed through show trials like a curse. Stalin's genius was to turn Nazi evil into an eternal alibi. So long as fascism was said to live somewhere outside or inside the Soviet Union, Stalin could present himself as the world's guardian. The same man who signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact now declared himself the planet's chief anti-fascist. It was Goebbels' playbook inverted but intact. Name an enemy, dehumanize him, and make him immortal. Soviet propaganda films of the late 1940s replayed Nazi atrocities in obsessive detail. Piles of corpses, burning villages, screaming mothers. The message was clear. Remember what they did, and never trust anyone who doubts the party. It was not empathy that these films demanded. It was loyalty through trauma. The horror of the past became a leash for the present. Even the architecture of memory served the same function. Memorials rose across Eastern Europe, massive, silent, glorious. But they did not commemorate grief. They proclaimed power. The Soviet soldier was cast not as a mourner, but as a conqueror. The suffering of millions became decoration for the myth of liberation. By 1953, the USSR had built its entire moral identity around the ghost of Nazism. The enemy was gone, but he was too useful to bury. The Reich had fallen, yet its shadow marched on in Soviet headlines, textbooks, and speeches. In Hitler's Germany, the Jew had been the eternal threat. In Stalin's Russia, it was the fascist. Both were invisible, both were everywhere, and both served the same purpose, to make fear endless. And so, in the final irony of history, Stalin preserved the last breath of the regime he had destroyed. Not its flag, not its leaders, but its logic. The idea that terror needs an enemy that never dies. Fact 14. The Cult of the Fallen. How Stalin stole the Nazi idea of martyrdom. Hitler had always understood that the dead could speak louder than the living. Under his rule, Germany turned its fallen soldiers into instruments of propaganda. Their deaths were not tragedies, they were offerings. Streets, schools, and stadiums bore their names. Films showed mothers smiling through tears, proud that their sons had fulfilled their duty to the Reich. Stalin, who watched this transformation with cold fascination, would one day resurrect it under a red banner. After 1945, Soviet propaganda began its own sanctification of death. The millions lost in the Great Patriotic War became saints in a new political religion. Their images appeared on posters, their names on granite walls, their voices in songs sung by children who had never known them. In Nazi Germany, the slogan had been, "You live in us." In Stalin's Russia, it became, "No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten." Both messages were identical in spirit. Grief turned into obedience. Goebbels had staged funerals as theater, coffins draped in flags, processions filmed from above, the Führer standing solemnly before eternal flames. Stalin's ceremonies copied every detail. Red coffins replaced black ones. Soviet marshals replaced SS officers. The music changed, the meaning did not. Every death was proof of faith. Every sacrifice a command to stay loyal. To doubt the party was to betray the fallen. By the late 1940s, Soviet films like The Ballad of a Soldier and They Fought for the Motherland elevated death into art. Soldiers didn't die in mud and agony. They died beautifully, lit by sunlight, whispering words of love to Stalin and to Russia. The screen aesthetic, wide shots, swelling choirs, the dying man's upward gaze, was pure Leni Riefenstahl, the same visual grammar used in Triumph of the Will. Stalin's directors had learned that grief, properly staged, was more powerful than fear. Both regimes taught their citizens that death for the state was the highest honor, and, more insidiously, that questioning that honor was blasphemy. Mothers were praised not for raising children, but for giving them to the motherland. Children learned to envy the fallen rather than the living. Funerals became patriotic rallies. Cemeteries became political stages. The psychological effect was devastating. In a world where dying for the nation was sacred, living for oneself was selfish. Stalin had discovered the secret Hitler died believing, that the easiest people to rule are those who see their suffering as holy. When the war monuments rose across the Soviet Union, tall, silent, spotless, they seemed to commemorate victory. In truth, they were reminders that death was still part of the state's machinery. The names carved in stone no longer belonged to families. They belonged to propaganda. Both dictators built their empires on the same terrible bargain. Give me your dead, and I will give them meaning. And long after both were gone, their monuments kept whispering the same message, that obedience is eternal, and that even the dead must serve. Fact 15. The last lesson, how Stalin proved that fascism never needed the swastika. When the war ended, the world believed it had buried fascism forever. The Nuremberg trials had judged the guilty, the swastika was outlawed, and the ruins of Berlin stood as proof that tyranny had been defeated. Yet in Moscow, another kind of victory was being prepared. Not over Hitler, but over the very idea that fascism had died. Stalin had learned too well from his enemy. He realized that fascism was not a flag or a party. It was a system, and systems could be reborn under any color. In the late 1940s, Soviet society began to resemble the mirror image of the Reich it had crushed. The personality cult, the youth indoctrination, the glorification of the army, the purification campaigns, the propaganda of eternal victory. All elements that once belonged to Hitler's Germany were now pillars of Stalin's empire. The swastika had been replaced by the red star, but the structure beneath remained hauntingly familiar. Where Goebbels had spoken of the 1,000-year Reich, Stalin promised a world without end. Both visions rejected limits, both erased the individual, both demanded worship in the name of collective salvation. The Soviet Union became what the Reich had wanted to be, a total civilization of faith and fear, where truth was not discovered but assigned. Stalin's genius was that he made it look like the opposite of fascism. He cloaked his empire in the language of liberation, not conquest. Where the Nazis had called their domination order, Stalin called his peace. His speeches echoed the same rhythm as Hitler's, but with words reversed. Where Hitler said, "Germany above all," Stalin said, "humanity under socialism." In both cases, the meaning was the same: submission dressed as unity. Even the war itself, that ultimate moral boundary, was rewritten to serve him. Hitler's armies had burned Europe to purify it. Stalin's army had burned it to save it. Both men claimed to defend civilization. Both left ruins behind. But Stalin emerged from those ruins with a weapon Hitler never had: legitimacy. The world wanted heroes, and Stalin offered himself as one. By the early 1950s, his face hung in every classroom, every office, every home. Not as a man, but as a symbol of endurance. A symbol built with the very tools his enemy had forged. History often describes Stalin as the destroyer of fascism. Yet in the quietest, cruelest way, he preserved its essence. He proved that tyranny could survive even its own defeat, so long as it learned to speak the language of freedom. When Berlin fell, the world thought an era had ended. But the truth was simpler, darker. One empire had copied another before the ashes cooled. Stalin didn't conquer Nazi Germany. He inherited it. Its fears, its rituals, its lies. And though the flags have changed, the machinery of control they built still hums quietly in every century that follows. History likes to think evil dies with its symbols, but symbols fade, systems adapt. And sometimes, the victors become the most faithful students of the defeated.